Hi, I'm Katie from What Katie Did, and welcome back. Being heavily into the vintage 1940s and 1950s, I often get asked if I feel like I was born in the wrong decade, and I'm sure if you're the same as me, you'll find you're asked the same question a lot as well. And my answer always is no. I'm quite happy living in the years that I do live. When you look at times in the past, you always look back at them with rose-tinted specs, and when it comes to the 1940s in particular, we were at war, and it was a horrible time to live. I know now when you look at the movies and when you talk to people who survived the war, they always say about how close families were and how everyone make do and mend, and how everyone worked together, and how the country had this make, mend and do and get up and go and keep going attitude. But in reality, given a choice of living in a war-torn country or living in a peaceful world, I take the peaceful world every day of my life. Having said that, you have to be aware that we as a human race, we just don't learn. And while I'm talking about not wanting to live in a war-torn England, there still are children around the world who are still living in war-torn countries and still being killed every day. And the act of war is absolutely horrific, and I can't believe we live in such a so-called humane society where we are still at war and where people still are getting killed on a daily basis. When you look back to the 40s, it was an interesting time, especially for women. During war, I mean, the one good thing to come out of war is there's such a huge advance in things like technology, engineering, medicine, and also women's rights. And I'm actually on holiday at the moment near Glastonbury in Somerset, and this is an original land girls' cottage. Now, I've spoken before about during World War II, women started to work, often for the very first time. And we generally think of them in factories, building Spitfires and ammunition and things like that. But an awful lot of them actually had to work on the lands, because a lot of the men had to go to war, and that left the farms underhanded. And farming at this time was even more important than usual, because we weren't able to import very much at all. The boats coming in, the merchant navy were getting bombed, as well as the actual navy, so there was no guarantee of any food getting in at all. So it was of extreme importance that the country could actually grow enough to feed itself. It turns out, I've been doing my reading this morning, and it turns out that England was the only country at war who actually conscripted women as well. And to begin with, it was just between the ages of 19 and 40 who had to register at the labour exchange and be given jobs. And then they extended that up to age 51. And yes, you could go into the factories, or you could be a land girl, which basically meant you went to work on the farms. And there's kind of good news and bad news. The good news is that the minimum wage came in 1940, which is great, just in time for the land girls. But unfortunately, it applied to men only. So agriculture and farming was the lowest paid industry of all. It was a super tough job. And also women got paid about half of what men would have got paid. So they really earned their money, the land girls. As well as the hard physical work of being a land girl, there was also resistance from the farmers who didn't think they'd get value for money from the land girls. And this happened throughout industry, that employers were actually resisting employing women, even though they didn't have enough people to employ, because they were worried that the women wouldn't be able to do their jobs. And by the end of the war, the farming industry had turned around, and women were getting almost paid the same amount as men. So when I talk about during World War II, there's great advances for female rights. That is in the case of 4 or 5 years that women were put almost on the same level as men, whereas at the beginning of the war, the men didn't want to be employed at all. So it's just huge advances in a short amount of time. The place I'm staying at is called the Corrugated Cottage, and it's 4 miles away from Glastonbury in Somerset. And the couple who owned it, the husband was a sculptor, and they finally looked into the history of this cottage, and they discovered that it was used by land girls during the war. And they totally revamped it, unvamped it to the way it would have been when the land girls were staying here, and it's full of interesting artifacts. It's gone as far as close to the truth as it possibly could be, while still having some modern day comforts. For example, there's loads of 1940s vinyl here, but you do have electronic gramophone to play it on, so you don't have to wind it up. And while you'll be sleeping on CC41 beds, you'll have you certainly won't have CC41 mattresses. Obviously, we have electricity and things like that, so it's not a luxurious experience, but it's a lot more luxurious than it would have been in the 1940s. And you've got your nice open fire, and it's very comfy and cozy at night to listen to the gramophone, and also to go through their extensive book collection, which is one of their books here that I was reading from earlier. Some of the things I'm kind of used to because I'm into the 40s, but I can imagine it would have been a bit of a shock to people who aren't as aware of the 40s that as me and my family are. For example, in the bathroom, which is in here, they've got a little thing about gas masks for babies, and if you had a baby, basically you were given a kind of a tank. So if they needed a gas mask, they were baby was put in this gas mask tank thing, which is pretty horrific when you think about it. And I've got my own gas mask handbag here, which I proudly bought a few years ago, and if I open it, it's got my gas mask in, because if you were a civilian, you still had to go everywhere with your gas mask, and if you're a woman, you wanted to try and make it look pretty, so it's still got the gas mask in here. But when you think about it, it's actually pretty horrifying to think that you had to walk around and do your day-to-day life carrying a gas mask just in case there was an attack. The good thing about being a land girl and living in the country is that you didn't have to worry about the threat of bombs so much. Now, in where I am at the moment, they've actually built an Anderson shelter, which is what you'd have in your back garden, which is basically it's a tin. It's a bit bigger than a tin shed, but it is a corrugated tin shed. And you'd have to go if the warning sirens went off. You'd go out to your Anderson shelter and sleep out there until the clearance siren went off. If you didn't have room for an Anderson shelter, a lot of people just used to hide under their kitchen tables. And I've got a family story with this where my grandfather at Exeter, he came home from work to find his wife and my mother under the kitchen table, and he was like, what are you doing under the kitchen table? And they'd heard the siren go off, but they didn't realise it was a clearance siren, not the starting siren, so they'd got totally confused. Things were trickier if you lived in London, of course, because there you didn't have room for an Anderson shelter or even a Morris shelter, which is kind of it was just like a big cage really. And if you didn't have room for either of those, then you were kind of stuck, especially if you were living in a block of flats. And there was a lot of, even back then in London, there were a lot of apartment buildings there. So what people tended to do is they thought, where's the safest place we can go? And it was the tube stations. So people used to go down and sleep on the underground stations, which on the underground platforms, which the underground was very resistant to. Firstly, it wasn't safe for travellers getting off the train, because you wouldn't be able to see where you were going, and people would be getting off the train and you get trodden on and all kinds of things. And secondly, the underground stations weren't actually bomb-proof either. And so you can imagine if you were in your house and your house got bombed, that it wasn't your fault, but it was something that horrific that happened. So if you're on the platform and it got bombed, that would be on London transport, and it would have been a huge catastrophe and devastation. So the underground didn't want people to sleep on the station platforms. However, eventually they realised it would actually be safer, and they wanted to do it officially and more organised. So people were safe and looked after, and everyone knew what was going on, and it was a lot more organised. So they actually started building underground shelters, and it's quite interesting because I'd known there were underground shelters before, but what I didn't realise that they were all built along the Northern Line. And the reason for this is that the underground were looking post-war, and they wanted to be able to transform the underground shelters into something they could use, and they decided they wanted to join them all up and have a super speedy new Northern Line going from north to south, which is great, I guess, if you're a civilian who lives along the Northern Line, but not so much if you live. I mean, I used to live in Ealing, so I was on the end of the Central Line, and then I moved to Willesden Junction, and that was way up on the Bakerloo line. So if I was in London during World War II, it would be a huge trek for me to get to the Northern Line. They actually managed to build these shelters in 2 years. This was during the Blitz, and a lot of it was done by hand. And it's an amazing feat of engineering to actually make these in time. And I did a tour of Clapham South station a couple of weeks ago, and I was talking to a lady there, and she was like, she couldn't believe that they'd actually built these underground shelters in this amount of time. And we were discussing about how, you know, today in that amount of time they wouldn't have even got the tender signed off. So it was amazing to actually build these things in that amount of time. By the time they were built, however, the Blitz had finished, and so they were using them. They were still in use. They were used mainly by the services and the army. People would stay there before they were shipped somewhere else. It wasn't until 1944 that they actually came into use again, and it was amazing to walk around and think the amount of people who slept. They were actually never used to full capacity, but to think of the amount of people who slept under the ground in quite primitive conditions. They basically, you had a ticket, and that told you what bunk you were in, and because it was never 100% full, families were kept together, and they had their bunks, and they some of them put curtains across the front of the bunks. But what I found quite interesting was that you had to take everything out. There was like 180 steps down, 180 steps up, and you had to take everything down with you, all your blankets, all your pillows, all your mattresses, even everything had to go back down. And then the next morning at 7 o'clock, you had to take it all back up again. And the only exception to this rule was that if your house was actually bombed and uninhabitable, then you could keep everything down underneath the ground in your little area. But the conditions there were pretty primitive. Looking at lifestyles in the 40s and 50s, it was quite shocking to find out that these underground shelters were still being used up to 1956 as a budget. It was a budget hotel. It was after the war. I've said earlier that the Northern Line were hoping to actually build and extend the Northern Line and make a super fast version, and it turned out that as soon as the war finished, we had no money whatsoever. So that plan went out the window. And of course, once the war finished, there were still people living there because their houses had been bombed, and they didn't have anywhere to go. So people were still living there after the war. Clapham South Shelter didn't shut until 1956. There were some army people billeted at Goose Street Shelter, and one of them was smoking, and there was a fire which lasted 2 days. No one was killed, but it was enough for the government to decide, no, enough's enough. Of course, they could have told them they could have stopped smoking and banned smoking, but that was unacceptable. So instead, they closed all the deep shelters as hotels, and that was that. That was the end of the story. They have been in use over the years since the war, though. They've been used to store secure documents, and also more recently for growing vegetables. So it's going back, being the land girls full circle, from growing vegetables on the lands when we needed the food, and now they're being grown in the original deep shelters in London, which is a crazy turnaround story. Having gone to a lot of reenactment events over the years, I've always been slightly concerned about how the real vets think about everyone dressing up in 40s style and not exactly reenacting World War II, but, you know, driving jeeps and tanks and everything else. And we've done a few at the War and Peace show, and I can remember my husband talking to some of the vets there, and basically they're happy to be acknowledged and for what they did for their country, and that they're happy to be remembered. There's nothing untoward about what they think about us at all. There was another time when I was actually in Normandy for the D-Day landings. This was the 65th anniversary of the D-Day landings, and we were at Pegasus Bridge, and I heard, and there was this the very famous cafe there, and all the vets were there having coffee, and we were there, and I heard someone say that they were going to reenact the parachute jump over the bridge, and I thought, well, isn't that a bit close to the truth? You know, what aren't the vets going to be upset about this being reenacted? Because isn't it a bit tasteless? And it turns out that it was actually one of the guys who did it the first time around. So, I mean, when you look at the vets, unfortunately, they are very, very old now, and it's a real privilege to be able to meet and talk to them over the years. The fact that they survived the war, they just seem to be so full of life now, and it's just a privilege to be able to meet them and talk to them. We have to remember that when we look back at the 40s, we need to remember the bad as well as the good, and we can't look back and say, oh, it was an amazing time to live and families were so happy, because there was just so much tragedy, as there continues to be tragedy across the world due to war today. And I just hope one day we'll all see sense, and war will be a thing of the past. If you would like me to discuss more about the 1940s or 50s, or just focus on fashion, please let me know, and I'll talk to you soon, so take care.